52 years old, and for the past decade I've been living with a secret that's defined every decision I've made, every relationship I've avoided, and every night I've spent staring out my window at the stars. In my home, hidden from neighbors, from authorities, from everyone who might ask questions I couldn't answer, I raised something that wasn't human. I called it Echo. And last month on September 17th, 2004, they came back for it. I live alone on 18 acres outside of Kalispell, Montana. I worked, at the Stillwater lumber mill doing inventory and bookkeeping. Quiet job, steady pay, the kind of work that doesn't draw attention. My nearest neighbor is 2 miles down a dirt road that turns to mud every spring. It's the kind of isolation most people find lonely. For me, it became necessary. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. There were times over the past 10 years when I convinced myself it was impossible, that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the rational explanation was somehow right there if I just looked at it from the correct angle. But the rational explanation doesn't account for what I saw, what I touched, what I fed and clothed and protected for a decade. The rational explanation doesn't account for Echo. I'm telling this story now because they're gone, because the choice has been made, and I'm left here trying to understand what it all meant. Some people might call me crazy. Others might say I should have gone to the authorities immediately, that I had no right to make the decisions I made. Maybe they're right. But standing in that forest clearing 10 years ago with something impossible dying in my arms, I didn't have the luxury of consulting experts or following protocols. I had minutes to decide, and I made a choice that changed both our lives forever. This is exactly how it happened. September the 23rd, 1994. I was 42 years old, driving home from the night shift at the mill around 11:30 p.m. The roads were empty like they always were that time of night. Just my headlights cutting through darkness, and the occasional eyes of deer reflecting back from the tree line. I had the radio on, some talk show out of Missoula discussing the baseball strike, and I was thinking about whether I had enough coffee for the morning. Then the sky lit up. At first I thought it was lightning, but the light was wrong. Blue-white instead of the usual yellow-white of a thunderstorm, and it streaked horizontally across my field of vision rather than striking down from clouds. It moved fast, faster than anything I'd seen before, leaving a trail that hung in the air for several seconds before fading. The light was bright enough that I had to squint, and then it disappeared behind the tree line maybe half a mile from the road. I didn't hear an explosion. That's what I remember most clearly, the absolute silence after the light vanished. No boom, no crash, nothing. Just the sound of my truck's engine and my own breathing, which had suddenly become very loud in my ears. I should have kept driving. That's what any sensible person would have done. Call it in when I got home. Let the sheriff's department handle whatever meteorite or satellite debris had come down. But something pulled at me, a feeling I can't quite describe. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper. I slowed the truck, found a widening in the road where I could pull off, and sat there with the engine idling for probably 3 full minutes, trying to decide. The forest to my left was part of the national land that bordered my property. I knew these woods. I'd hunted deer here, hiked the trails, spent enough time among these trees that I could navigate by landmarks even in limited light. The impact site couldn't be more than a quarter-mile in, based on where I'd seen the light disappear. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, a heavy mag light that my brother had given me years before. I had a first aid kit in the back of the truck, which I took as well, though I couldn't have said why. What was I expecting to find that would need bandages? The forest floor was covered in pine needles and fallen leaves, soft enough that my footsteps made almost no sound. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s. Above me, through gaps in the canopy, stars were visible. Normal stars, normal sky, like nothing unusual had just torn through the atmosphere. I found the impact site by smell before I saw it. Something was burning, but not wood or vegetation. It was a sharp chemical odor that reminded me of ozone and hot metal, and something else I couldn't identify. The smell made my eyes water. The crater was small, maybe 8 feet across and 2 feet deep at the center. The earth was scorched black, still smoking slightly, and scattered around the perimeter were fragments of something that definitely wasn't rock. The pieces were smooth, almost organic looking, with a surface that seemed to shift colors in my flashlight beam, dark blue to deep purple to black. Some fragments were no bigger than my thumbnail. Others were the size of dinner plates. I knelt at the edge of the crater, setting my first aid kit down beside me, and that's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it under the ringing in my ears from the adrenaline. A kind of whimpering or mewing, like a kitten or a very small animal in distress. The sound came from the center of the crater. I moved closer, scrambling down the loose dirt of the impact site, my boots sliding on the scorched earth. My flashlight beam swept across the bottom of the crater and landed on something that made my brain stall, trying to process what I was seeing. It was small, maybe 18 inches long, curled into a fetal position. At first glance in the dim light, I thought it might be a monkey or some kind of primate, but the proportions were wrong. The head was too large for the body, the limbs too thin. The skin, I could see skin, not fur, was a pale gray color with an almost translucent quality, like I could see the shadow of organs beneath the surface. It wasn't moving except for rapid, shallow breathing. Steam rose from its body in the cold air. I stood there frozen, my mind cycling through explanations. A deformed animal. Some kind of genetic experiment that had been transported in whatever crashed here. An elaborate hoax, though. Who would go through this much trouble and why? But even as I tried these explanations on, I knew they didn't fit. The creature made that sound again, weaker this time, and I saw one of its arms move slightly. The hand had 4 fingers, each too long and too delicate, and they clutched at nothing in the air. It was dying. Whatever it was, wherever it had come from, it was dying in front of me. I made a decision in that moment that I've questioned 10,000 times since. I took off my jacket, a heavy canvas work coat lined with fleece, and I climbed down. I wrapped my jacket around it as gently as I could. The creature's skin was cool to the touch, much cooler than it should have been for something that was breathing. I wrapped my jacket around it as gently as I could. Its eyes opened. They were black, completely black, no visible pupil or iris, just pools of darkness that reflected my flashlight beam. And it looked at me, not the unfocused gaze of an animal, but direct eye contact that held intelligence and fear, and something else I recognized even then, a plea for help. I gathered the creature against my chest, feeling how light it was, and I climbed out of that crater. I walked back through the forest to my truck, opened the passenger door and set my jacket-wrapped bundle on the seat. Then I drove past the sheriff's station, past the fire department, past every place I should have stopped, and I took it home. The drive to my house took 12 minutes. I know because I watched the dashboard clock the entire way, my eyes flicking between the road and the bundle on my passenger seat, and the glowing numbers that seemed to move in slow motion. 11:47 became 11:48, became 11:49. Every minute that passed, I expected the creature to stop breathing. Every minute, I told myself I should turn around, go to the hospital, find someone who actually knew what they were doing. But I kept driving. My house sits at the end of a gravel driveway, a quarter-mile from the main road. It's a small ranch-style place, 2 bedrooms and a workshop I'd built myself off the back. The porch light was on a timer, and it illuminated my truck as I pulled up and parked. I sat there for a moment, engine running, looking at my house like I was seeing it for the first time. This was the last moment I could change my mind. I could still drive back, leave the creature somewhere it would be found, call in an anonymous tip. The bundle in my jacket shifted slightly, still breathing. I turned off the engine and carried it inside. My hands were shaking as I cleared off the kitchen table. Mail, a couple of coffee mugs, the newspaper I hadn't read. I unwrapped my jacket carefully and laid the creature on its back on the smooth wooden surface. Under the bright kitchen lights, I could see details I'd missed in the forest. The skin was definitely translucent. I could see what looked like a network of veins or vessels running beneath the surface, though they were the wrong color, more silver than red or blue. The head was disproportionately large, probably a third of the total body length, and it had a delicate bone structure I could make out through the skin of its skull. No hair anywhere, no ears that I could see, just slight indentations on the sides of the head. A small slit of a mouth. 2 holes where a nose should be, but flat against the face, almost flush with the skin. It was breathing rapidly, its narrow chest rising and falling too fast. The skin had taken on a bluish tinge that I instinctively knew was wrong, even without any frame of reference for what was right. I needed to warm it up. That was my first concrete thought that felt like something I could actually do. The creature was too cold. That much was obvious from touching it. I turned the thermostat up to 78 degrees and grabbed every blanket I owned from the bedroom closet. I wrapped it loosely, making sure not to restrict its breathing, and then I just stood there, staring at what I'd brought into my home. The rational part of my brain was screaming questions. What was I going to feed it? What if it was diseased, carrying something that could kill me? What if it needed medical intervention I couldn't provide? What if someone had seen that light in the sky? What if people came looking? What if there were more of them? But underneath the panic was something else, something that had made me climb into that crater in the first place. This was a child. I didn't know what species, didn't know what planet or dimension or impossible origin point it came from, but it was a child, and it was hurt, and it needed help. Those were the only facts that seemed to matter in that moment. I pulled a chair up to the table and sat down to watch it breathe. Around 1:30 a.m., the rapid breathing began to slow. The bluish tinge to its skin started to fade, replaced by a color closer to pale gray, with hints of something almost iridescent when the light hit it at certain angles. It was warming up. The shaking in its limbs, which I'd barely noticed before, gradually subsided. At 2:15 a.m., its eyes opened again. Those black eyes that reflected the overhead light like dark mirrors. It looked at me, and I felt something I can only describe as a presence in my mind. Not words, not thoughts exactly, but an impression of awareness. It knew I was trying to help. I reached out slowly and touched the back of its hand where it lay on top of the blankets. The skin was still cool but warming. 4 long fingers and what might have been a thumb, though the joint structure was different from human anatomy. The creature didn't pull away from my touch. "I don't know what you need," I said out loud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet kitchen. "I don't know what you eat or how to help you, but you're safe here. I promise you're safe." I don't know if it understood language. I don't know if it understood anything I said. But it closed its eyes again, and its breathing continued to stabilize, and I sat there next to it through the rest of the night. By dawn, I had made several decisions. First, I wasn't going to report this. I couldn't articulate exactly why, but every time I considered picking up the phone, something stopped me. This creature, this child, would become a specimen, a test subject, something studied and confined and afraid. I'd seen enough documentaries about government facilities and classified research to paint that picture clearly. Second, I was going to protect it. Whatever that meant, however long it took, I was going to keep it safe. Third, I needed to figure out how to keep it alive. I called in sick to work for the first time in 6 years. Then I went to the workshop and started building a space where the creature could recover, where it could be warm and secure and hidden from anyone who might come to my door asking questions. I didn't know if anyone would come. I didn't know if that light in the sky had been seen by others, if there were authorities already searching the forest, if I was on borrowed time. But I worked fast anyway. The first 3 days were trial and error, most of it error. I had no reference point, no instruction manual, nothing except instinct and observation, and the growing certainty that if I made too many mistakes, this creature would die. It wouldn't eat. That was the first major problem. I tried everything I could think of: water, milk, mashed banana, chicken broth, even blood from a steak I'd thawed, thinking maybe it was carnivorous. It showed no interest in any of it. When I tried to bring a spoon to its mouth, it would turn its head away weakly, and I'd see something in those black eyes that looked like confusion or distress. By the second day, I was becoming desperate. The creature was getting weaker. It barely moved except to breathe, and even that seemed to require tremendous effort. I'd set up a makeshift bed in my workshop, a cot with layers of blankets, a space heater running constantly to keep the temperature at exactly 78 degrees, which seemed to be the point where it was most comfortable. I sat on the floor next to the cot, my back against the wall, watching it breathe and trying to think. In the forest, it had been curled up, exposed to the elements. What would it have needed to survive there? Not food in the traditional sense, maybe. Not if it couldn't eat what I was offering. That's when I noticed the way its skin seemed to absorb moisture from the air. The workshop was humid. From the space heater, and the creature's skin had a slightly different quality now, less dry, more supple. I got up and filled a spray bottle with lukewarm water, then misted it gently over the creature's exposed skin. The reaction was immediate. Its whole body seemed to relax, and for the first time since I'd brought it home, I heard it make a sound, a soft exhalation that might have been relief. I sprayed more water, coating its arms and torso and the exposed parts of its legs, and watched as the skin seemed to literally drink it in. Within minutes, the translucent quality became more pronounced, and I could see those silver veins beneath the surface pulse with something that looked like renewed circulation. Water. It absorbed water through its skin. Over the next several hours, I experimented cautiously. Plain water worked. Water with a small amount of sugar dissolved in it worked better. I could see a visible improvement in the creature's energy level. Water with salt added caused what looked like distress, so I stopped that immediately. I settled on a solution of water with just a trace of honey, misting the creature every 2 hours and watching it absorb the nutrients directly through its skin. By day 4, it was sitting up. The improvement was remarkable. The creature could support its own weight, could track my movements with its eyes, could even make small voluntary gestures like reaching toward the spray bottle when I brought it out. It was still weak, still fragile looking, but it was alive and getting stronger. I moved it from the workshop into the house, into the spare bedroom I'd been using for storage. I cleared out the boxes of old paperwork and seasonal decorations and set up what I can only describe as a nursery. A proper bed low to the ground, a humidifier running constantly. Towels I kept damp laid out so it could rest its hands and feet on moisture when it needed to. The window had heavy curtains that I kept drawn at all times. The creature watched me set up this space with what seemed like curiosity. When I brought in a lamp with a soft bulb, its eyes followed the light source, and it reached out one long-fingered hand toward it. I moved the lamp closer, and it touched the warm glass gently, then pulled back. Not burned, just exploring. "Light," I said, pointing at the lamp. That's called light. I had no idea if it understood language or if it even had the capacity to learn human words. But I talked to it anyway, because the silence felt wrong, and because some part of me needed to treat it like a person rather than just a thing I was keeping alive. On day 7, it stood for the first time. I was changing the damp towels when I turned and found it on its feet next to the bed, swaying slightly, but upright. It was taller than I'd realized, about 3 feet when fully extended. The proportions were still wrong by human standards, all elongated limbs and oversized head. But there was a strange grace to the way. It moved. It took one step toward me, then another, then its legs gave out and it collapsed. I caught it before it hit the floor, feeling how light it was. It couldn't have weighed more than 15 pounds. I carried it back to the bed, and it looked up at me with those black eyes. And I felt that presence in my mind again, stronger this time. Not words, but something like gratitude mixed with frustration at its own weakness. "You're doing fine," I told it. "You just need more time." By the end of the second week, I'd established a routine, misting every 2 hours during the day, every 4 hours at night when I set an alarm, maintaining the room temperature at 78 degrees exactly, keeping the humidity level high. The creature was gaining strength daily, could walk short distances, could manipulate objects with those long fingers. And it was watching me constantly. I became aware that it was studying me the same way I was studying it. When I read in the evenings, it would watch the movement of my eyes across the page. When I ate dinner, it observed every motion, fork to plate to mouth. When I listened to the radio, its head would tilt slightly, and I had the impression it was analyzing the sounds, trying to decode them. On day 16, I came into the room to find it holding one of my books. Not reading it. I don't think it understood written language, but mimicking the gesture it had seen me make, holding the book open and moving its eyes back and forth across the pages. I sat down on the floor next to where it stood by the bookshelf. "Do you understand anything I'm saying?" I asked. The creature looked at me, then very deliberately it nodded. Just a small dip of its oversized head, but unmistakable. My heart started pounding. "Can you understand all of it? Or just some?" It held up one hand, fingers spread, then brought the thumb and first finger close together. A small amount. It understood a small amount. "Jesus," I whispered. "You're learning." It nodded again. I spent the rest of that evening teaching it basic gestures, pointing at objects and naming them, demonstrating yes and no with head movements, which it picked up immediately, showing it how to indicate hunger or thirst or discomfort. By the time I went to bed that night, we had established maybe 20 different signals we could use to communicate. It wasn't language. Not really, but it was a start. On day 23, I named it. I'd been calling it the creature in my head, which felt increasingly wrong as it demonstrated more personality and intelligence. I tried several names, saying them out loud to see if any felt right. When I said echo, it tilted its head and made a soft sound I hadn't heard before, something between a hum and a chirp. "Echo," I repeated. "You like that one?" Another nod, more emphatic this time. "All right then, Echo it is." Echo walked over to where I sat on the edge of the bed and placed one cool, long-fingered hand on my arm. I felt that presence in my mind again, and this time it carried something I could almost interpret. Not words, but emotion, comfort, trust, connection. I put my hand over Echo's, and we sat like that for a long time, while outside the sealed curtains the Montana autumn deepened toward winter, and somewhere in the night sky above my isolated house, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the impossible thing happening in this small bedroom. Time moves differently when you're raising something that shouldn't exist. The days blur into weeks, weeks into months. and suddenly you look up and realize years have passed, and the small, fragile creature you found in a crater has become something else entirely. Echo grew, not at a steady, predictable rate like human children, but in spurts that seemed to correspond with phases of the moon, though I was never sure if that was actual correlation or just my mind trying to find patterns where none existed. In the first year, Echo went from 3 feet tall to nearly 4.5. The body remained thin, almost skeletal by human standards, but it was strong, stronger than it looked. I learned that the hard way when Echo casually moved my workshop table 6 inches to the left to reach a tool that had rolled underneath. The physical changes were matched by cognitive development that sometimes left me struggling to keep up. By mid-1995, Echo had learned to understand most of what I said, even if the vocal anatomy couldn't reproduce human speech. The mouth was too small, the throat structure too different. Instead, Echo learned to communicate through a combination of gestures, written words, and something else. Those impressions of emotion and intent that I felt directly in my mind when we were close to each other. I bought a chalkboard and set it up in Echo's room. Within 2 months, Echo was writing simple sentences in blocky, careful handwriting. Water, please. Cold tonight. What is music? The questions were constant, insatiable curiosity about every aspect of the world. I became a teacher by necessity. I showed Echo books, maps, photographs. I explained the weather and seasons and why the leaves changed color. I demonstrated cooking and showed Echo how electricity worked, how the radio pulled voices out of thin air, how the truck engine turned gasoline into motion. Echo absorbed everything with the same intensity, treating each new piece of information like a gift. But there were things I couldn't explain, questions I had no answers for. Where Echo came from, whether there were others, what had caused the crash, whether anyone was looking for the child I'd taken from that crater. In 1996, I had to expand Echo's space. The spare bedroom was too small for a growing child who could now walk, run, and climb with unsettling agility. I converted half of my workshop into a larger room, installing a lock on the door that only I had the key to. I told myself it was for Echo's protection, but in darker moments I wondered if it was also containment, if some part of me was still afraid of what Echo might do. Those fears proved groundless. Echo was gentle, careful with objects, and even more careful with me. When I cut my hand on a saw blade in late '96, Echo brought me bandages and sat next to me while I cleaned the wound, emanating concern so strong I could feel it like a physical presence. The next day, I found a drawing Echo had made, crude but recognizable, of me smiling with an intact hand, a wish for healing. I kept working at the mill, maintaining the fiction of my solitary existence. Co-workers who barely knew me before knew me even less now. I turned down invitations to the annual Christmas party, to bowling nights, to a weekend fishing trip. I couldn't risk anyone coming to my house, couldn't risk questions about why I was always rushing home, why I seemed distracted, why I sometimes smelled faintly of the specialized nutrient solution I developed for Echo's misting. Schedule. The isolation would have been crushing if not for Echo. In the evenings after my shift, I'd come home to find new drawings waiting for me. Echo's way of sharing the day's experiences. A bird Echo had seen through the window. The pattern of frost on the glass. My truck from memory, drawn with surprising accuracy. By 1997, Echo had discovered television. I'd kept it off for the first 2 years, worried about overstimulation, but eventually I relented. Echo became fascinated with nature documentaries, watching with absolute focus as the narrator explained migration patterns and hunting behavior and the complex social structures of elephant herds. One evening, I found Echo crying, actual tears running down that strange gray face, while watching a segment about a mother whale separated from her calf. "It's okay," I said, sitting down next to Echo on the couch, a piece of furniture we'd started sharing during movie nights. "They find each other again at the end," Echo wrote on the chalkboard. "Does the baby remember its mother?" The question hit me harder than it should have. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think so. I think children always remember somehow." Echo nodded slowly, and I felt a wave of something complex coming from the child. Grief and longing, and questions that couldn't be written on a chalkboard. I put my arm around Echo's narrow shoulders, and we watched the rest of the documentary in silence. In 1998, the first real scare happened. A black SUV drove slowly past my driveway 3 times in 1 week. On the 4th day, a man in a suit came to my door. He had a badge, some government agency I didn't recognize, and he asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in the area. Lights in the sky, strange animal behavior, unusual electromagnetic readings. I stood in my doorway, very aware of Echo hidden in the locked workshop 20 feet behind me. And I lied with a calmness that surprised me. "Nothing unusual," I said. "Pretty quiet out here. That's why I like it." The man handed me a card with a phone number. "If you do see anything, we'd appreciate a call. There's been some irregular activity reported in this area. Probably nothing, but we like to be thorough." I took the card and watched him drive away. Then I went inside and threw the card in the fireplace. That night, I started construction on a hidden room, a space behind a false wall in the workshop where Echo could hide if anyone ever came searching. It took me 3 weeks working late into the night, but I built it solid. Insulated walls, separate ventilation, a lock that engaged from the inside. I showed Echo the space when it was finished. "If anyone ever comes to the house, anyone you don't know, you hide here. You lock this door and you don't come out until I say it's safe. Do you understand?" Echo looked at the hidden room, then at me, and wrote, "They are looking for me." "I don't know," I said. "Maybe, but I won't let them take you." Echo's hand found mine, those long, cool fingers intertwining with my own. "Why do you protect me?" I didn't have a simple answer. How could I explain that finding Echo had given my isolated life meaning? That watching this impossible child grow and learn had become the center of my existence? That somewhere along the way, Echo had stopped being the creature from the crater and had become family? "Because you're mine to protect," I said finally. It was the closest I could come to the truth. By 1999, Echo was the height of an average 10-year-old human child, though the body proportions remained distinctly non-human. We'd developed our own language, part English, part gesture, part those direct emotional impressions that required no words. We had routines, movie nights on Fridays, drawing sessions on Sundays, long evenings where I'd read aloud and Echo would listen, head tilted in that characteristic way, absorbing stories about worlds that must have seemed as alien to Echo as Echo's origins were to me. I was 47 years old, and I'd spent 5 years raising an alien child in secret. And somehow it had become normal. I'd forgotten what my life had been like before that September night in 1994. The loneliness, the emptiness, the sense that I was just going through motions until it was time to die. Echo had changed that. Echo had changed everything. But change was coming again, whether I was ready for it or not. The black SUV returned in March of 2000, and this time it didn't just drive past. It parked at the end of my driveway for 45 minutes while I watched from behind the living room curtain, my heart hammering against my ribs. Echo was in the hidden room, had gone there the moment I'd seen the vehicle turn onto my road. We'd practiced the drill dozens of times, but this was the first time it wasn't practice. A man got out eventually, different from the one who'd come to my door in 1998, younger, wearing casual clothes that were trying too hard to look local, jeans that were a device I didn't recognize and held at a device I didn't recognize, and held it up, pointing it at various parts of my property. Some kind of scanner or detector. I stayed perfectly still behind the curtain. The hidden room was insulated with materials I'd researched carefully, lined with a metal mesh that was supposed to block electromagnetic signals. I'd built it based on information from conspiracy theory websites and ham radio forums, never knowing if any of it would actually work. Now I was about to find out. The man spent 20 minutes walking the perimeter of my property that was visible from the driveway. He never came to the door, never called out, just scanned and observed and made notes on a small tablet. Then he got back in his SUV and left. I waited 2 full hours before I let Echo out of the hidden room. The child emerged stiff and shaken, and I felt waves of fear coming off Echo like heat. We didn't talk about it. I just held Echo until the shaking stopped, and we both understood that the life we'd built was more fragile than we'd wanted to believe. After that, I became paranoid about security. I installed motion sensors on the driveway and along the property line. I bought a police scanner and listened to it religiously, learning the codes and patterns of local law enforcement. I started varying my routes to and from work, watching my mirrors for vehicles that followed too long. The hardware store in Kalispell probably thought I was building a bunker. In a way, I was. I bought supplies in small quantities from different stores. Extra insulation, more metal mesh, materials for a second hidden room in the main house. I told the clerks I was doing renovations, soundproofing a music studio, building a workshop addition. Different story for different stores, nothing that would create a pattern. Echo seemed to understand the new tension in our home. The child became quieter, more careful about staying away from windows even with the curtains drawn. Drawing sessions continued, but now the images were different, darker, full of shadows and hiding figures. One picture showed Echo in a cage with people in suits standing around taking notes. I found it under the bed and never mentioned it, but I doubled my efforts on the security measures. In July of 2000, a woman appeared at the hardware store asking questions. I overheard her talking to the clerk while I was in the lumber aisle. She was asking about unusual purchases, large quantities of specific materials, anything that might indicate someone was building specialized containment or shielding. The clerk, bless him, told her that customer information was private and suggested she come back with a warrant if she had legal concerns. I left my cart where it stood and walked out the back entrance. I didn't return to that hardware store for 8 months. The watchers, that's what I called them in my head, never came with sirens or official notices. They were subtle, persistent, and deeply unsettling. A car parked on the main road with a view of my driveway. A man at the diner in town who seemed too interested in conversations about local wildlife and unusual sightings. A brief power outage that felt less like accident and more like someone testing my response. Through it all, Echo continued to grow and learn, but now there was a layer of anxiety underneath everything. I caught Echo standing at the window sometimes in the early morning, looking up at the sky with an expression I couldn't read. When I asked what was wrong, Echo would just shake their head and write, "Nothing, just remembering." Remembering what? I never learned. Echo's memories of life before the crash were fragmented, shared with me in brief impressions that I could barely interpret. A sense of others like Echo, a feeling of traveling vast distances, the comfort of being surrounded by family, though family was a concept Echo struggled to explain in terms I could understand. "Do you want to go back?" I asked once, late at night when we were both awake and restless. "If you could, would you want to go home?" Echo was quiet for a long time, then wrote, "This is home now. You are home." But I saw the way Echo looked at the stars, and I knew it was more complicated than that. By 2002, the active surveillance seemed to decrease. Either they'd given up on my area, or they'd gotten better at hiding their presence. I wanted to believe the former, but suspected the latter. I invested in better curtains, planted fast-growing evergreens along the property line for additional screening, built a greenhouse attachment to the workshop that gave Echo more space while maintaining the illusion that I was just an eccentric gardener. Echo helped with the construction. The child's strength had continued to increase in ways that defied the slender frame. Echo could lift support beams I struggled with, could work for hours without tiring. And the mind, Echo's problem-solving abilities, had exceeded my own, somewhere around 2001. I'd find elegant solutions to construction challenges I'd been wrestling with, modifications to my designs that were objectively better than my original plans. "You're smarter than me," I said once, watching Echo calculate load-bearing requirements in a notebook filled with precise diagrams. Echo wrote, "Different, not smarter. You know things I will never understand." "Like what?" "What it means to belong here, to be from Earth, to not be afraid all the time." That hurt to read, but it was fair. Despite all my efforts, Echo lived in constant awareness of being hunted, of being other, of existing in a world that would see Echo as a specimen rather than a person. In 2003, the nightmares started. I'd wake to the sound of Echo moving around in the workshop, agitated, emanating distress so strong it pulled me from sleep. I'd go out to find Echo standing in the dark, hands pressed against the walls, making a sound I'd never heard before, a high-pitched keen that made my teeth ache. "What's wrong?" I'd ask, and Echo would just shake, unable or unwilling to explain. It happened once or twice a month at first, then weekly. The episodes would last anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. Afterward, Echo would be exhausted, drained in a way that worried me. I tried to find patterns, phases of the moon, time of year, weather conditions. Nothing correlated in any obvious way. Then in January of 2004, during one of these episodes, Echo grabbed my hand, and I felt something different than the usual emotional impressions. This was clearer, almost like a transmission. Images flooded my mind, lights in the sky, geometric patterns, a sense of distance closing, something approaching. "Are they coming?" I asked. "Your people, are they coming for you?" Echo's grip tightened, and I felt a complex swirl of emotions, hope and fear and longing and dread, all mixed together until I couldn't separate one from another. "I don't know," Echo wrote after the episode passed. "But something is changing. I can feel it." I wanted to ask more questions, to understand what Echo was experiencing, but the child couldn't explain it any better than I could explain what color looked like to someone who'd never seen. It was something Echo felt, something fundamental that was shifting in ways neither of us could control. That night I sat in my bedroom with the door closed and allowed myself to imagine what it would mean if Echo's people came back. Relief, probably, that Echo would be reunited with their own kind. Grief at losing the child I'd raised for nearly a decade. Fear about what Echo's people might do to the human who'd been keeping one of their children. And underneath it all, a question I'd never wanted to face. What right did I have to keep Echo here in the first place? The first object moved on its own in April of 2000. I was in the workshop, teaching Echo how to use a hand plane when a tool slid 6 inches across the workbench. No vibration, no explanation. "Did you move that?" I asked. Echo's head shook slowly, but the child's eyes showed recognition. "Show me," I said. "If you can do it again, show me." Echo looked at the plane, and I felt a change in the air. The plane trembled, then slid smoothly across the bench. My hands went numb. "How long have you been able to do this?" Echo wrote, "Not long. Weeks maybe. Small things. Not on purpose." Over the following months, the phenomenon increased. A cup would slide when Echo was thirsty. A book would fall open to a page Echo wanted. The door would swing open when the child wanted to see if I was home. By 2001, Echo could move objects up to 20 pounds. By 2002, the range had extended to 30 feet. I watched Echo stack blocks without touching them, arrange tools in precise patterns, turn pages hands-free. The electrical problem started in late 2002. Lights would flicker when Echo was upset. The television would change channels on its own. My truck refused to start one morning after Echo and I had argued. I brought home books about electromagnetic fields. We conducted experiments, Echo focusing on a light bulb, trying to make it brighten or dim. The results were inconsistent but undeniable. "Your people," I said. "Can they all do this?" Echo conveyed through impressions that these abilities were natural but developed with age, like puberty in humans, which meant Echo was maturing, growing up, moving toward adulthood. In March of 2003, I woke at 2 a.m. to find my bedroom filled with blue-white light. Echo was floating 3 feet off the ground, skin glowing from within. Objects throughout the room were suspended in midair. My alarm clock, a photo, a book. "Echo," I said carefully, "can you hear me?" No response. Echo's lips were moving, forming shapes in an unknown language. I touched Echo's hand. The light vanished. Echo dropped. I caught the child, and all the floating objects clattered down. "What happened?" Echo wrote after I'd carried the child back to bed. "You were floating, glowing, moving things while you were asleep." Echo's fear was palpable. "I don't remember." The floating happened twice more over the next year. I started sleeping with my door open, ready to intervene. But the most dramatic change came in June of 2004. We were in the greenhouse when Echo suddenly gasped and grabbed my arm. I felt a surge of energy, like touching a live wire. Every light in the house blazed. The radio turned on, cycling through stations at impossible speed. My truck's horn blared. Echo's eyes had gone completely white. I grabbed Echo in a full embrace, and the energy discharged through me. My vision went white, my ears filled with static. Then it was over. Echo collapsed, unconscious. When Echo finally woke hours later, the child's eyes were back to normal, but something had changed. The presence in my mind was stronger, clearer. "What's happening to you?" I asked. "I'm becoming what I'm supposed to be," Echo wrote, "but I don't know what that is." I felt a grief I couldn't name. Echo was slipping away from me through biology I couldn't control. Something was coming. I could feel it the same way you feel a storm approaching. August 3rd, 2004. I came home from work around 6:30 p.m. and knew immediately something was wrong. Echo was standing in the living room, motionless, hands pressed against the window glass. The child hadn't moved at the sound of my truck, hadn't turned when I opened the door. "Echo?" I touched the child's shoulder. The skin was ice cold. Through the contact, I felt something new, a pull like gravity directed upward. Echo's hand lifted, one finger pointing at the sky. "I don't see anything," I said. Echo's hand moved to the chalkboard. "They're coming." My blood went cold. "Who's coming?" A nod then. "I can feel them, getting closer. They're looking for me." "How long until they get here?" I felt the answer before Echo wrote it. "Soon. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Soon." We didn't sleep that night. Around 11:30 p.m., Echo stiffened. I felt it too, a change in the air, a frequency in my bones. Echo went to the window and yanked the curtain aside. 3 lights in the sky. Brilliant blue, brighter than any star, arranged in a perfect triangle. They hung in the darkness above the tree line about 2 miles from my house. "Is that them?" I asked quietly. Echo nodded. We watched for 45 minutes. The lights never moved, never changed. Then, at exactly 12:15 a.m., they vanished. Echo collapsed. They left, the child wrote, but they'll be back. Tomorrow night. Closer. How do you know? I just know. 3 nights. Then they'll come down. The second night, August 4th, I stayed home from work. The lights appeared at 11:47 p.m. exactly. Closer now. Maybe a mile away. What do they want? I asked. Echo wrote, they didn't know where I was. The crash broke. Something. They've been searching. Now they've found the right area. And tomorrow night, they'll be close enough to be sure, and then they'll come down. The lights stayed for an hour before vanishing. When they disappeared, Echo turned to me. I'm scared, the child wrote, of them, of leaving you, of going somewhere I don't remember. I pulled Echo into a hug. Whatever happens, I need you to know that these have been the best 10 years of my life. You made everything mean something. Through our contact, I felt, I understand. And same. The third night, August 6th, I wrote a letter explaining everything and put it in a fireproof box. Echo spent the day organizing belongings. The first book we'd read together, A Stone from the Property, a t-shirt of mine the child wore sometimes. Evening came too fast. At 11:45, Echo stood and went to the back door. Not yet, I said. Yes, they are, Echo wrote. I can feel them, right above us. I followed Echo outside and looked up. At first, I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw the triangle of lights directly overhead. Between them was a dark shape, a craft, massive, hovering in complete silence, maybe 300 feet above my property. Echo walked to the center of the backyard and stood in the open grass, face turned upward. I stood beside Echo and reached for the child's hand, those long fingers wrapped around mine. I don't want to lose you, I said. Echo looked at me with tears on that strange face. The child rode in the dirt with one foot. I don't want to lose you either. The lights began to descend. The craft lowered in complete silence, settling into a hover about 50 feet above my backyard. This close, I could see the seamless surface that absorbed light, the way the air shimmered around it, geometric patterns that might have been writing. Echo's grip on my hand tightened. I felt terror, but underneath it, recognition. A column of white light appeared beneath the craft, touching down in the grass 10 feet away. Something began to descend within it. The shape resolved into a figure, like Echo but taller, maybe 7 feet, with the same elongated proportions, the same translucent gray skin. But this being had a presence that commanded attention. It wore something that might have been clothing, material that shifted colors as it moved. The being's feet touched the ground. We stood there in darkness, staring at each other. The being looked at Echo, and I felt something pass between them. Communication I couldn't access. Echo made a soft sound and took one step forward, then stopped and looked back at me. Go ahead, I said. It's okay. Echo released my hand and walked toward the being. They stood facing each other, and the being reached out and touched Echo's face gently. I saw Echo's eyes close. When they opened again, Echo turned back to me. They want me to come home, Echo wrote. They've been looking for me since the crash. I know. You should go. But I don't. Remember home. I remember here. I remember you. The being spoke, its voice like multiple tones layered over each other. Echo listened, then wrote, They say I'm needed. My family thought I was dead. My mother... Echo paused. I have a mother. She's alive. She's on the ship. Of course Echo had a mother. Then you have to go. You have to go home to her. What about you? I'll be fine. It was a lie and we both knew it. The being spoke again, and Echo translated. They want to thank you for saving me, for keeping me safe. Echo wrote something that made my heart stop. I don't want to go without you. Echo, no. Your family's up there. Your mother. You can't give that up for me. You're my family too. You raised me. You protected me. How can I just leave you? The being spoke sharply. Echo wrote, they say I have to decide now. Either I come now or they leave and I stay here forever. Then go. Echo, please. Don't throw away your chance because of me. Echo looked at me, then at the being, then back at me. Then the child pulled me into a hug and I felt love so pure it brought tears I couldn't control. Thank you, Echo wrote in the air with one finger, leaving glowing traces. For everything. For my whole life. I love you, I said, crying openly. That will never change. Echo pulled back, looked at me one more time, then turned and walked to the being. They took hands and stepped into the column of light. I watched them rise. I watched them disappear into the craft. I watched as it began to rise, accelerating upward faster than anything human-made could move. I watched until it was just 3 points of blue light, then nothing but stars. I stood in my backyard until dawn, staring at empty sky. They left something behind. I found it 3 days later in Echo's room, a small object about the size of a paperweight, made of the same material as the crash fragments. It shifted colors as I turned it, blue to purple to black, and it was warm to the touch. When I held it, I felt echo, not actual communication, but something like an echo, a preserved impression of presence, emotions, memories. I felt 10 years compressed. The fear and pain of the crash, the slow healing, the gradual trust, the love we built. And underneath, a message and feeling. I'm safe. I'm home. Thank you. I will never forget you. I held that object and I wept. Not quietly, but with huge gasping sobs. I cried for everything I'd lost, for the loneliness now been waiting for me. But also, and this surprised me, I cried with relief. Because Echo was home. Echo was with family, with people who understood the child in ways I never could. Echo wouldn't have to hide anymore. I'd done my job. Mission accomplished. What's about it? I took a week off work. I spent it packing away Echo's belongings, boxing everything carefully and storing it in the hidden room. If anyone came asking questions, they'd find nothing. On the 8th day, I went back to work. I told co-workers I'd had a death in the family. They offered condolences and didn't pry. Life continued. The same routine I'd had before Echo, except it wasn't the same at all. Before, I'd been alone by choice. Now I was alone because the one person I'd let into my life had left. I started talking to Echo, out loud, alone in my house. The object sat on my nightstand and I'd hold it while I talked, feeling that faint impression of presence. 3 months passed, then 6. Time moved forward, whether I was ready or not. I learned that I could survive loss that felt unsurvivable. I learned that love doesn't end when the person you love leaves. It transforms into something you carry forward. I'd been changed by knowing Echo. I'd experienced something impossible, had raised something miraculous, had loved something that crossed every boundary we think defines us, that couldn't be taken away. 1 year after Echo left, I was sitting on my porch when I saw lights in the sky. My heart stopped. Had Echo come back? But these were just planes. Normal aircraft with normal blinking lights. The universe was mundane again. I held Echo's object and felt that familiar warmth. I hope you're happy, I said to the empty sky. I hope you found your mother. I hope you remember me sometimes. The object pulsed with warmth, and I chose to believe it was an answer. I'm 52 years old now. For 10 years, I raised an alien child in secret. They came back in September of 2004, and I let my child go home to a family I'd never meet. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was also the right thing. People ask me sometimes if I believe in UFOs. I just smile and change the subject because I don't need to believe. I know. And that knowledge, that certainty that we're part of something bigger and stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine, that's what Echo gave me. I was chosen for a reason I'll never understand. Maybe it was random chance. Maybe there was something more. It doesn't matter why. What matters is that I said yes. When I could have walked away, I chose compassion. And for 10 years, I had a family. I had purpose. I had love. That's enough. I still look at the stars and wonder which one is Echo's. I still hold that object and feel the warmth. I still talk to someone who can't hear me. Some people would call that crazy. I prefer to call it remembering. Echo changed everything, showed me what it means to love completely, to protect at all costs, to let go when holding on would be selfish. I wouldn't trade those 10 years for anything, because I raised something impossible. I loved something miraculous. And somewhere out there, among stars I'll never reach, my child is alive and safe and home. That's enough. That has to be enough.